to allow our economy to grow and our local governments to be able to upgrade their water infrastructure systems. With that, Madam President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Cook.
Senator from Mississippi.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
And I come to the floor today to call members' attention to recent action taken at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which convened in Monaco earlier this month. The OSCE considered and passed with overwhelming support a resolution on the rule of law in Russia and the case of Sergei Magnitsky. This is a resounding and much welcomed rebuke of Russia's deplorable human rights record and systematic corruption. With the Magnitsky resolution, the OSCE, made up of 56 participating states spanning Europe, Central Asia, and North America, reaffirms the widespread call for justice and rule of law. The international group has sent a clear signal to human rights violators that they will be held accountable. The OSCE resolution supports government efforts to ban visas, freeze assets, and employ other financial sanctions against those connected to the illegal detention and tragic death of Sergei Magnitsky. The young lawyer was beaten and denied medical care in a Russian prison after uncovering a vast conspiracy by Russian officials involving $230 million in tax fraud. Sergei Magnitsky died as a result of this treatment, and no one has ever been held responsible for his death. I've been a member of the Helsinki Commission for the last several years, and I've seen firsthand the contributions that the OSCE has made to advance democratic, economic, security, and human rights issues. I was unable to attend the Parliamentary Assembly meeting, but I'm grateful that our colleague, Senator John McCain, was able to be there to highlight the importance of this particular issue. The Magnitsky case is just one example of the gross human rights abuses and official impunity in Russia. But as Senator McCain noted in his statement before the OSCE meeting in Monaco, the demand for justice for Sergei is what has mobilized the world in his memory. Senator McCain is right to point out that the OSCE resolution, as well as national initiatives to punish those implicated in Sergei Magnitsky's death, is not anti-Russia. Indeed, a return to the rule of law would be of great benefit to the Russian people. To quote my colleague, Senator McCain, defending the innocent and punishing the guilty is pro-Russia. The virtues that Sergei Magnitsky embodied, integrity, fair dealing, fidelity to truth and justice, and the deepest love of country which does not turn a blind eye to the failings of one's government, but seeks to remedy them by insisting on the highest standards. This, too, is pro-Russia. And I would submit that it represents the future that most Russians want for themselves and their country, to end the quote from Senator McCain. Senator McCain then goes on to encourage the Assembly to align with the highest aspirations of the Russian people. Sergei's aspirations for justice, for equal dignity under the law, and for the indomitable spirit of human freedom. Like the OSCE, members of this Senate will also have an opportunity to lend our voices to the call for justice and accountability. The Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act would impose travel and financial sanctions on those associated with human rights crimes. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and to uphold this country's commitment to the protection of human rights. I salute the leadership of my colleague and friend, Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, for his leadership in this regard, and I'm pleased to note that the Magnitsky Act was included during consideration of extending normal trade relations to Russia in yesterday's Senate Finance Committee markup. We're making great progress on this issue, and I look forward to a vote here on the Senate floor, Madam President. In conclusion, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that Senator McCain's full remarks at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly be entered into the record at this point.
Without objection.
And at this point, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President, I would ask suspension of the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. In just a couple of minutes, we're going to be voting on a very important policy, a very important bill. I'm proud to sponsor with a number of co-sponsors, a number of colleagues, called the Bring Jobs Home Act. And it goes to the heart of what has been happening in a global economy when we haven't been paying attention to our tax code or other things that we ought to be doing to be able to bring jobs home. And other countries are aggressively working to take our manufacturing base, to take our middle class, because they know that when they look at our country, you have a middle class because we make things and grow things. And so they're rushing to be able to make things and to innovate and so on, and to create incentives for our jobs to be shipped overseas. Now, we know we're in a global economy. We know our companies are competing with countries, and we have a whole range of things that we've been working to do to be able to support and incentivize and help manufacturers and other businesses here to innovate, expand advanced manufacturing, IT services, other things. But what we haven't been paying attention to is how our own tax code actually is incentivizing or supporting, at the very least, supporting and helping companies ship jobs overseas. And there's a very important, very basic policy we'll be voting on today. If a company decides to pack up and move overseas, should they be able to write that off their taxes, and you and I, all of us as American taxpayers, pay for it? I don't think there are too many people in the country that would say yes to that. In fact, I can't imagine why anybody would say yes to that. I mean, the reality is that if somebody loses their job at a plant and then they find out that they get the privilege as an American taxpayer to help pay for the move, folks say, "Are you kidding me?" Or they say a whole lot of other things. This bill, the Bring Jobs Home Act, is very straightforward. Simply says we're not going to pay for that anymore. That loophole will be gone. However, if you want to bring jobs back, we'll be happy to let you deduct those costs as a business expense for bringing a job home, and in fact, we'll give you another 20% tax credit for 20% of your costs on top of it. So we're happy to incentivize coming home and to support your efforts to come home, but we're not paying for you to leave. And that's very basically what this is about. Now, we're going to have a vote on whether or not to proceed to this bill. And as we know, around here, unfortunately, we've seen the process become a process that used to be used, rarely is now used on every bill, where we can't even get to the bill to vote on it with a majority vote without going through a supermajority to be able to stop a filibuster, which is what right now basically has been happening. There's an objection. We have to get 60 votes to overcome it. Otherwise, the filibuster continues. And so we will need to do that today. We will need bipartisan support to do that. I hope we will have that. A couple of weeks ago, we came together in strong bipartisan support, worked together very, very hard, long hours to pass a farm bill. That's about growing things in America. And now we have an opportunity to work together, come together on a bipartisan basis to support making things in America. We don't have a middle class unless we make things and grow things. And it's not going to make any sense if we continue to have a tax policy that actually encourages or helps you to leave America. What we've seen now is that we are actually losing jobs. We know that in the last decade, 2.4 million jobs were shipped overseas, and that's just the ones that they were able to count at this point. And so 2.4 million jobs have been shipped overseas at minimum, and we help to pay for it. Now, the good news is we have a lot of companies now for a lot of reasons. The fact that we have the most productive, the smartest, most talented workforce in the world. We have high productivity in our country. We have companies now bringing jobs back, and we want to accelerate that, to support that effort. I'm proud that in our automobile industry we are seeing jobs come back with support and help from policies that have allowed retooling loans to retool older plants. Ford Motor Company's taken their largest plant in Wayne, Michigan, retooled it, along with investments in advanced batteries. Jobs are coming back from Mexico, and they're bringing jobs back from other countries as well. GM is doing the same kind of thing. Chrysler, I'm sure other companies as well. We know many, many companies, large and small, are looking at this. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to have a businessman from Michigan who is the CEO of a company called Galaxy Solutions. He actually lives in New Jersey, but is now having a major presence in Michigan and Detroit, hiring 500 people in IT, information technology. Those are jobs coming back from India, Brazil, China. And one of the things that I heard as he was talking yesterday is that, you know, when you look at the bottom line, that costs matter, and that if we have a tax code that helps him bring jobs back rather than supporting him to take jobs away, to ship them overseas, it makes a difference. It matters. It matters not only for the cost, but for the signal it sends about how serious we are about creating jobs in America. I can't imagine anybody that doesn't want to see Made in America again on everything. We're not going to get there if we don't start with the basics. And, Mr. President, that's what this is. And I know you have talked about this so many times as well. I mean, this is about the basic premise of saying we are going to stop loopholes in the tax code that reward companies that are shipping jobs overseas, and we're instead going to support and incentivize jobs coming back. Now, we know there are many other things in addition to this that we need to do. We need comprehensive tax reform in a global economy, no question about that. And that is something I'm confident that we will be doing in the months ahead and into the next year. And we need to do that, and we need to do it on a bipartisan basis. But that is not a reason not to close this loophole, to stop this policy that makes no sense. We have a lot more to do. We know that. We need to come together around policies that focus on innovation and education and rebuilding America and supporting the great entrepreneurs of the country, small businesses, large businesses. We know that. There's much, much to do. But today we have a chance to do something. We have a chance to do something that is very, very straightforward. We have a chance to simply say the tax code in America is not going to reward or pay for the costs of American jobs being shipped overseas. It's as basic as that. No other country in the world would do this. In fact, I think we're crazy to have this kind of a policy in place. So today's a chance to say, no, we're not crazy. We get it. We know there's a lot to do. But let's come together on one thing. And then we can come together on the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and continue to build and rebuild our economy for the future. But today is very simple. Today is the day to say no to American taxpayers helping to pay the costs for American jobs being shipped overseas. It's a day to say yes to supporting through tax deductions, jobs coming back, and additional incentives on top of that for them to do that. I hope my colleagues will come together and very strongly vote yes on this measure so that we can proceed to debate and to pass something that I know is strongly supported across our country. Thank you, Mr. President.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 442, S3364, a bill to provide an incentive for businesses to bring back jobs to America.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S3364, a bill to provide an incentive for businesses to bring jobs back to America, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal,
Sanders, aye. Okay.
Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johann, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson, Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Beckidge, Bennett, Bingaman, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Heller, Leahy, Manchin, McCaskill, Murray, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Sanders, Shaheen, Udall of New Mexico, and Whitehouse. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. McConnell. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Corker, Crapo, Dement, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kyle, Lugar, McConnell, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Vitter, and Wyden. Mr. Hatch. No. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Nelson, Nebraska, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Zayat, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Ms. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Enzi, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. McCain? Mr. McCain? No. Mr. Conrad? Aye. Mr. No Way? Mr. No Way? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Hoven? No. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey? Aye. Blandrew? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman. Aye. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no.
On this vote, are there any senators who have not yet voted or wish to change their votes? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 56, the nays are 42, 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I'm not in a position now to announce normal votes today. I hope we can be there in just a little bit, but we're trying to work through some procedural matters now, and hopefully we can do that in the next half hour or so.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to take a moment to speak about what just happened